Good afternoon and welcome to this first debate of the SOFA series. The motion before the House is this House believes a nationwide lockdown is not the solution to a global pandemic. Noted that this debate has the benefit of hindsight from several months of lockdown both in the UK and internationally, allowing the various approaches to lockdown to be examined and scrutinised. It should be recognised that this debate is looking at, in essence, the pros and cons to a nationwide lockdown in the UK, as standard debate format dictates motion to be UK-based unless otherwise stated. And there is no one-size-fits-all solution for globally managing a pandemic, least of all a correct answer. As a result, this debate is exploring policy and approaches in the face of a new virus, and the deemed winning side taking victory as a result of their arguments being delivered best and left undefeated or unchallenged. So without further ado, I introduce the speakers. For side proposition, we have my mother, Mrs. Anne Warren, supported by Jamie Warren, my older brother. On side opposition, we have my father, Wing Commander Ian Warren, and my younger brother, Ben. Main speeches will be 5 minutes long, with 30 seconds of protected time either side. Protected time is time when no points of information, interjections, short questions or comments are allowed. I will mark the beginning and end of protected time with this noise, which indicates points of information are now allowed. When you hear that noise again, no more points of information will be allowed. 2 taps indicate 5 minutes is up and speakers should bring their remarks to a close. Beyond this, continuous taps indicate this time is up and the speaker should stop speaking. Following the 4 main paper speeches would normally be a floor debate, but in the absence of anyone other than the dog, I shall ask some questions to both sides to consider. There will then be 2 summation speeches, approximately 2.5 minutes in length, with no points of summation being allowed. There would then be a vote, but again with the absence of an audience, and without me wanting to be too dictatorial, we should agree to disagree and conclude then. So without further ado, I call the first speaker for side proposition, Mrs. Warren.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, the motion today is this House believes a nationwide lockdown is not the solution to a global pandemic. We firmly believe here on side proposition that the combination of significant economic and social damage with the fact that other options are available all highlight why a lockdown is both counterintuitive and does more harm than good. Now, we are not advocating that a lockdown of a population does not work in stemming transmission of a virus. In fact, that is exactly what it does, and all it does, which is the crux of the issue. I'm going to discuss why lockdowns crumble in the face of better alternatives, answering the motion before us, before Jamie explores the significant economic and social damages a nationwide lockdown causes. So, a good starting place is the end result. What are the exit strategies from the current situation? Well, they are either vaccines or herd immunity approach. In terms of vaccinations, the complexities of establishing a vaccine, manufacturing and distributing it mean it would take until at least the mid-2021 to have a successful and viable vaccine, let alone then vaccinating the required 60 to 70% of people needed to be immune to the virus in order to stop it spreading easily, known as herd immunity. On the topic of herd immunity, the other exit option, statistics published by the Office of National Statistics highlight how an estimated 0.25% of the community population in England would test positive for COVID-19. Clearly, any mass release of the population without a vaccine would see transmission rate spikes, hence the government's staggered approach. However, what if we had not locked the population down so severely and so quickly? Ultimately, we must all realise we are never going to remove risk. It is about mitigating and reducing risk. The avoidable mortality rate in Britain, which includes accidents, unintentional injuries and some preventable diseases, is currently 228 people per 100,000, or 0.2%. However, the risk from coronavirus for the general population does not rise above this figure until people over the age of 50. Professor Devi Shriptar, Chair of Global Public Health at Edinburgh University, stated that there will never be no risk. It's about how we reduce that risk.
I'm on that point.
Just as we do with other kinds of daily dangers, like driving and cycling. No, thank you. Therefore, when we examine better alternatives to a lockdown, we begin to see that policy does more harm than good. If in the early stages of a pandemic, international borders were semi-closed, allowing for stringent health checks, then initial external carriers would be reduced. Moreover, if vulnerable members of society, where possible isolated and shielded, during any initial rise in case numbers, and communities of vulnerable people such as care homes had targeted support to significantly mitigate risk of infection, then immediately those most likely to be severely ill or die from the virus would have that risk of transmission reduced. On top of this, providing that the infrastructure was in place to support the NHS, and Britain has proved how quickly it can implement additional resources through the Nightingale Hospital programme, the NHS should be able to cope. Nevertheless, just because additional resources are available, this should not mean that a more reckless approach is adopted. Strict hygiene practices such as hand washing and social distancing should be implemented. Nevertheless, better to have a partial usage of the new facilities than overstretch resources that could lead to unnecessary deaths. What we are saying here on side proposition is, in essence, that if appropriate and stringent mitigation methods are used to protect the population, especially those most vulnerable, and the appropriate infrastructure exists to avoid undue strain on the NHS, then a policy of herd immunity, not through vaccination as this is initially impossible, but through transmission between healthy asymptomatic carriers, would allow for a sort of business as usual in the face of a global challenge. A nation not crippled by lockdown but sensibly protecting the vulnerable and its health services whilst continue to operate it is a far more sustainable option than hunkering down the workforce and hoping that is enough. For these reasons, I beg to propose.
Thank you very much for that, Molly. I now call to the floor the opening speaker for the opposition, Wing Commander Ian Warren.
Mr. Chair, my wife and sons, it's an honour to be starting the debate for the opposition today on the topic of a nationwide lockdown is not the solution to a global pandemic. Today I'm going to be focusing on the result that COVID-19 has had on criminal activity in both a physical and online sense. And later Ben will be speaking on the environmental impact that quarantining has had on COVID-19, as well as the key point of this entire debate, is quarantine going to help preventing the spread of the infection between people? My first point I would like you to consider is the positive effects COVID-19 has had on what is commonly termed street crime and narcotic criminal activity. The FBI, Europol and a recent report by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime all contend that the effects of, in effect, a global lockdown have hampered, seriously in some cases, criminal and OCG's abilities to conduct their nefarious activities. This in the main due to an increase in movement checks and surveillance and a decrease in unnecessary travel. Illicit activity is being spotted far easier, more street dealers are being arrested, and muggings, car thefts and burglaries have seen in some cases a 25% reduction in both reported and anecdotal occurrences. In short, their activities have a much higher chance of being detected. Greater surveillance at airports and ferries means that the international smuggling trade is struggling to operate. Fewer shipments being available, leading to those available shipments using higher volumes of illegal contraband, which leads to a greater chance of being spotted. Key example we've seen was in Myanmar's northeast Shan state on Monday the 18th of May 2020, where Jeremy Douglas, the regional coordinator of the United Nations Office for Drugs and Crimes, said the scale of the seizure, which was methamphetamine, was truly off the charts. This is being a prime example of the pressure quarantine has put on the illegal narcotics trade, therefore demonstrating that quarantining people has done more than just prevent COVID. It is in effect causing hugely detrimental effects on the national and international trafficking, smuggling and crime rings, certainly in the short to medium term. However, the benefits go beyond catching criminals. Societies and microcosms of them are benefiting. The many British teenagers involved in the urban and county lines narcotics problem within the UK now have some temporary relief from the often brutal gangs they are forced to work for. As well as the blows that are currently being taken to transporting narcotics, the lack of product means that the lack of need for transportation gives many teenagers aware of a dangerous industry. My second point is that of cybercrime is also being affected. People are online far more than before due to isolation and general lockdown. To date, the reports are numerous about the various reprehensible activities criminal gangs are undertaking using COVID-19 as an opener. There are huge increases due to the virus and lockdown. FBI's phrase fourfold increase. UN Inter-Regional Crime and Justice Research Institute 350% increase, all point to the criminal elements exploiting people's fears and the perceived lack of counter-cyber actions. These activities pre-COVID-19 were to some just viewed as scams or some poor person trying to make a few dollars, or indeed merely a nuisance. Now, however, these criminal acts are being taken far more seriously. Both the general public and the organisations that are insistent to try and combat these illegal and often despicable acts are starting to begin to adjust the lexicon to use more poignant and, I contend, far more accurate terms, such as steal, terrorise, grievous financial assault. Whilst a lot of these dishonest acts have always been prevalent within the online world, their language has, I still contend, been too soft. Lockdown and more people affected by these fraudulent deeds are forcing more to wake up to this scourge and ask for resources to be directed against this personal and societal threat.
On a point of information.
Yes.
But that simply sounds like an acceleration in increased counter-cyber campaigns that would have happened anyway as our societal reliance on technology grows. So is that really a benefit of quarantine alone?
Definitely, it's a very good point, and actually there are some arguments to say it will happen. However, what this is presented as with a very short window of opportunity to get a grip of this situation whilst under controlled circumstances. Had the lockdown not been implemented, then the criminal cyber vocabulary may have just not morphed. But now we are treating this illegal and illicit activity as a very real threat and a crime that has victims and severe consequences. I have drawn attention to what is a huge benefit of this bad situation. We have a chance now to help to attack large aspects of illegal activity happening in the UK, while also being presented with an opportunity to stop viewing cybercrime as simply spam. It's a fine line between a police state and an opportunity for justice, but we can use this attempt at virus protection for more than just inhibiting physical contact. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was an excellent speech indeed. I now call to the floor the second speaker for the proposition, Jamie Warren.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, we've already presented to you on side opposition the logic behind why a nationwide lockdown is an unsustainable approach to the pandemic, and I'm now going to explore actually some of the major negative impacts a lockdown can and has had on the nation. But first, just to pick up on a few points from the opposition speech, I'd come straight to the speaker's points on crime, this idea that there's been some kind of short-term drop in criminal activity offering kids a way out, and that this presumably will then lead to a drop later. I would argue that that logic chain is in fact false, because crime is directly linked to drops in income and poor economic performance, things like loss of jobs, forcing people to turn to crime as a means to pay the bills. We saw in the wake of the previous 2008 financial crisis austerity leading to increased gang crime in London, such as county lines, directly due to fewer youth centres and facilities being available. Austerity is the end result of economic damage caused by quarantine, and so we would argue that actually, whilst there may be short-term benefits, the long-term impacts on crime, it's actually going to make it worse. Coming to the issue of the cyber activity, I think first of all it's important not to conflate state-sponsored hackers versus criminals. I think there is a big difference between cyber crime and cyber espionage. It's important to not conflate the two, because cyber espionage has been, really high on the national security radar for years, so to speak, with things like Stuxnet, showing that there's been a huge amount of funding and attention put into that for years. So actually quarantine is really having no measurable impact. This behaviour is now simply, trying to steal a vaccine, but actually it's no different to what has been seen previously. So not only is there no benefit to quarantine from counter-espionage in the cyber realm, but this idea that there's an increased attention on cybercrime is somewhat dubious. We would argue that actually quarantine, as again already stated, has simply accelerated programs that would have been brought in as our economic reliance on technology increases. The impacts of lockdown is twofold. It's economic and social. The economic impacts are somewhat obvious as to how they've come about. Locking down the nation cripples the economy, and this is not just detrimental, it is dangerous. Financial damages will have a much longer term effect than the pandemic. We only have to look at the fallout from the financial crisis of 2008 to see how wide-reaching and long-term economic damage can be. There can also be direct impacts in terms of the national death rate. For example, 10,000 suicides were linked directly to the 2008 financial crisis by Oxford University, which is, I'm sure you've noticed, is a third of the current UK death toll. Moreover, there is an uptick in deaths in every instance of severe financial shock anywhere in the world, according to research conducted by the New York Times. Therefore, on balance, we contend that priority must be given to maintain economic stability. Following on from that, and crucially, poorer financial performance means there is less money to invest in programs that will help to ultimately bring the pandemic under control and help prevent a repeat of the situation we found ourselves in. Things like socially distanced infrastructure, vaccination programs, and other such mitigation strategies all cost money, and it's therefore imperative that we're able to fund them. The relationship is symbiotic, so keeping the healthy workforce in place allows for financial security and making available enough finances to appropriately protect the population. Furthermore, with the potential for entire industries to collapse, things like theatres and bars, etc., there is added likelihood of cultural as well as economic damage. We've already begun to witness the catastrophic economic cost of the pandemic, with the Financial Times writing that there have been at least 21,000 more companies failing in March this year compared with the previous year, and that's just in the UK. Across the pond, unemployment has reached a record high, up 10% as over 20 million Americans have lost their jobs. By locking down and still trying to salvage small retailers, the government is increasing public spending exponentially, something that will be paid by higher taxation post-virus in a post-virus world where, owing to the economic damage from the lockdown, unemployment will be far higher than in recent times. It becomes a self-deprecating cycle, failing businesses supported by government loans paid for by people in terms of higher unemployment and much greater financial insecurity, which we would contend will exacerbate issues with things like crime, already mentioned. This also opens up another potential...
Point of information,
please.
Very valid point, but surely the government has a duty of care to protect people. You concentrate very clearly on the economics, but there is a duty, an ethical duty of care.
Thank you, and we would totally agree, but actually we would argue that by maintaining that economic performance to allow, economic, social programs to be funded and prevent longer term damage to the economy, that actually the government is fulfilling its duty of care more so than it would be by damaging it needlessly with quarantine. Returning to my other point, such damage opens up another potential to deepen already stark inequalities in our country, the gap between the Zoom haves and the Zoom have-nots. There is a clear disproportionate effect of missed education on students from poorer backgrounds. If not managed appropriately, we contend that the economic impacts of this pandemic will be felt many years after any vaccine has cured the physical population.
Thank you very much for that, Jamie. That was an excellent speech, very well handled with the points of information. The Chair now recognises the final speaker for the opposition and our fourth and final main paper speeches, Benjamin Warren, to take the floor. Ben.
Okay. Thank you very much. Chair, lady, gentleman and a dog. It is honour to be speaking in this prestigious lounge as second speaker for the opposition on the motion, this House believes a nationwide lockdown is not the solution to a global pandemic. This afternoon, the Wing Commander has already informed you on the positive effect quarantine has had on both physical criminal activity and cyber crime. Today, I'll be focusing on two key aspects of this debate. Firstly, the environmental impact and how much the Earth has shown recovery in the last few months. And secondly, a topic that is incredibly important as social distancing rules relaxed. Has quarantine helped and should it be continued? However, firstly, I will address some points of rebuttal to the proposition. Firstly, Jamie brought up several times that there's a risk, and there is obviously high unemployment and many public businesses have been closed down. However, due to an excessive feeling of cabin fever when we finally break out of quarantine, the high demand on businesses and public services such as barbershops, restaurants, clubs, pubs will be able to help with employment and economic recovery, and the government needs to be focusing on helping the people inside that middle section, the middle section where we're all stuck at home, where we could look at, for example, helping out with the mental health cases, which you did also mention, perhaps by maybe diverting some of the excess NHS funds, which we have seen because we weren't hit as hard with quarantine and COVID-19 as we expected we were. So we do still have additional ways and even better systems than we've had in other cases to help these people. Now I will address more points later in my summation speech, but I'm going to move on, otherwise I'm going to run over. So to begin, clearly there are going to be questions which arise from quarantining people. Two of the biggest being, is it working and is it fair? Is it right for us to keep people locked inside their homes, removing a fair amount of rights and privileges that are necessary for daily life, such as exercising and socialising? And ultimately, is the payoff even worth it? One key reason for locking down the country would be to protect our National Health Service. We can all remember that before this virus, the medical sector was struggling, and now with the introduction of a global pandemic to their wards, they are faced with a potentially very dire situation that could change at a pin drop, with 7,500 medical staff being pulled out of retirement to make sure the healthcare service isn't overrun. We will probably all be aware that we did, as a country, underestimate and then arguably overestimate the scale of this virus, which can be seen with the new state-of-the-art Nightingale Hospital only being temporarily closed after only accepting 12 patients. However, just because a brand new hospital is semi-empty, it doesn't mean we should try to fill the beds. Enforcing strict measures can see us pull through this far quicker than us being hit by a second wave due to standard slipping. Physical separation is the easiest way to stop viruses spreading, with COVID-19 being on such a global scale, recording 5.24 million cases most recently, including 339,000 deaths. The more we focus on keeping separation until there is next to no risk of the spread, and as we have already committed to quarantine, the quicker businesses and people can go back to helping the economy recover once we finally decide to break out of the rut that we have now committed to. However, in terms of health, as I'm sure everyone has realised, most of us are not at a serious risk of infection. It is the members of the general population that have previous health issues and the older demographics of people that are at risk. In a country run and inhabited by largely younger people, we cannot put those at risk who have less of a political voice than ourselves. My second point regards the environmental impact that this quarantining has. Now, I appreciate that the government has no right to keep people inside on grounds of sinking CO2 levels, but they do have a right to take the appropriate measures to stop infection spreading. Environmental recovery is simply a bonus to this pandemic, one that can potentially slow the rate of global warming by up to 30 years. Since quarantine began, we've seen air quality increase by 11.6%, with CO2 levels sinking by 17%.
Point of information.
Let me finish, please. We saw dolphins return to Venice, as well as now being able to see the peaks of the Himalayas in Punjab clearer than ever, while also seeing the Eiffel Tower and the Indian War Memorial Gate looking almost as if the photos taken of them had been edited. Yes.
But would you not agree that a temporary environmental rebound is no substitute for sustainable reductions in damage in the long term, which is not possible to fund with economies crippled by quarantine?
Okay, no, I completely agree with what you're saying. However, I personally believe that due to the ability now for people to see through social media the massive positive effects that quarantining has had on the environment, that could be a serious wake-up call to the people that are currently inside, and I genuinely don't believe that thanks to the amount of time we've managed to have to prevent the environment basically dying, that we will be able to eventually sort it out again, and the environment, the economical crisis, won't affect it as badly as the benefits that have already happened. So both the country and the world have been given an opportunity and a reason to sacrifice a few months of our lives, which can still be used for productivity, meaning that we can enjoy a cleaner and safer Earth when life returns to normal. So to conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I hope we have managed to outline some key aspects of our side of the debate today. The benefits of quarantine are so much more than just preventing infection. It's given us an opportunity that has never previously been available to cut down on CO2 emissions and increase air quality, and it's given a window for the government to crack down on criminal activity, as mentioned by the Wing Commander. It is a proven way of preventing COVID-19 from being passed person to person, and it holds so many additional benefits. The world has finally started to recover from coronavirus as infection levels peak, and the environment shows signs of healing, so why ruin it now?
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much to all four of our main paper speeches. They were really rather good, actually. So at this point, we would now normally move to a floor debate, but in the absence of an audience, I've prepared some questions throughout your speeches to deliver to both sides. So to proposition, my first question is, I grant you economic damages are probably more longer term, they affect more in the long term than the damage caused by a pandemic. But surely a lack of a lockdown could open up to both the loss of a workforce through deaths and illness, and unnecessary excess public spending on healthcare as a result of a lax approach to stemming transmission rates by not locking down. Another question, or another thing for you to consider. Some would argue that a state has a duty to care for its people as opposed to simply making money, since when should we put making money before the lives and wellness of a country's citizens? To the opposition, I would say, or I would ask, lockdown cuts transmission rates. It's not being disputed. But could you consider the view that even a phased out lockdown will still see transmission rates rise, and thus it could be said a lockdown merely delays the inevitable, so to speak? And for both sides to consider, the COVID-19 pandemic has seen unprecedented levels of international lockdown, hence we're having this debate. Could national lockdowns become more of a norm, a more widely used approach or tactic to fighting diseases? And do we think this is right? So I now call the opposition's summation speech. Ben, please.
Okay. So, ladies and gentlemen, first I'm going to look at some points from the floor, and then from the proposition, I will then, sorry, I said that wrong, from the chair, and then the proposition, and finally I will summarise as what we as the opposition have said this evening. So we've only really had one key point from the chair, which I will sort of notice, that delaying the inevitable. And it is a good point that delaying the inevitable is not something we should be trying to do. However, it does actually have positive connotations. The longer we wait, the more time we have to advance technology and advance knowledge of environmental collapses that we are currently being faced with. The more time we have to focus on these issues, and as you say, delaying the inevitable, can then be used in the future to try and prevent this from happening and getting even worse. On some of the points made by the proposition this evening, I cannot read my own handwriting. The concept of herd immunity that was brought up several times by my mother. There is still a high risk of infection, obviously, with infecting people intentionally, which I'm sure that you will understand and appreciate, and it may be a risk that we have to take. And is it the government's right to allow that risk for people? And if not, in theory, would it not be more practical if people are going to feel uncomfortable about joining in with herd immunity, for them to take their own choice and quarantine instead? And if this herd immunity as a concept fails due to the fact that a virus on such a global scale holds several risks, it could reverse months of people giving up their free time, work, all the unemployment cases that we've now seen, the mental health issues. Everything could suddenly be lost by taking a simple risk, which I personally believe is a risk we should not be taking. So, of course, ladies and gentlemen, the key point this evening, the point of clash, is the government's duty of care versus freedom of choice. And the government cannot decisively let us make our own decisions if it puts many people in our population at their own risk. And we've already seen with the government trying to be severe on cases of on quarantining, especially in the southern US states, and we've all seen how certain people have decided to treat that anyway, endangering people's lives that clearly aren't their own, which I personally find to be quite a selfish act. So they can't physically let everyone just have their own choices, and they have to decide some things for us. The opposition have come forward today with a decisive and clear argument, proving that quarantine is still a useful, sensible and practical system to uphold until we can see a significant decrease in case numbers of COVID-19. The benefits run far beyond simply preventing disease. We can protect those who need protection from criminal activity, prevent those who move under the radar from fueling illicit activity in the United Kingdom, and help the Earth to recover from the last few hundred years of technological advancements taking its toll on the environment. Quarantine may create problems, but it also creates solutions. We can work to fix issues throughout these troubling times, from domestic abuse to mental health issues, but what we cannot do is run the risk of allowing COVID-19 to return, otherwise we are faced with even more problems than before. We can do what we can to help as a nation, but everyone needs to make a sacrifice for those who need more help than we do. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and thank you very much to our opposition. So finally, therefore, I call on the proposition summation speaker, Jamie.
Mr. Chair, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to start by addressing some of the questions that were posed by the Chair. So I believe the first one was that a lack of lockdown will lead to a reduction in the workforce due to loss and death. We would contend that actually the quarantine, that's happening anyway. We're seeing huge amounts of furloughing where remote working is simply not possible. So actually a huge amount of the country's workforce at the moment is crippled anyway. And that actually, the economy survives, the workforce survives through things like seasonal flu. Whilst I appreciate that is not an ideal comparison, I think that's a good starting point to go from when talking about tackling a respiratory illness. I think, again, on the point about excess spending to cope, well, we would argue that actually it's costing more money now to prop those companies up by having to pay the entire wage of the worker, when actually If that employee was off sick, that cost is being borne by the company. Your point about making money or the question about making money versus duty of care, we fully agree. I want to make this absolutely clear that the state has a duty of care to its people, but we contend that making money is directly linked to that. As I've already outlined, the economic damage could have a catastrophic impact on people's lives. We believe more people will suffer, and therefore that the duty of the state in this instance is to provide economic stability to its people. Could there be more quarantines? Well, I think we can probably all agree that the answer is yes, but the proposition would argue that this is a bad precedent to set. We believe that it's the equivalent of a sledgehammer being used to crack the nut. Which leads me quite nicely to our summation. It's very simple, ladies and gentlemen. Quarantine is unnecessary. Its benefits are temporary and the damage it causes is massive and long-term. Crime and environmental issues are both clear examples of this. Economic damage is directly linked to feeding these first two issues. Frankly, with respect, wake-up calls are no substitute for the money required to fund such programmes. We have the capacity to cope, as the opposition have admitted, and that capacity only stands to be undermined by quarantine causing poor economic performance. Conversely, good economic performance allows for greater funding to allow healthcare services, environmental protections and social programmes to be maintained. This is about mitigation of risk, and we would argue that quarantine in that instance simply goes too far. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jamie. And like I said, thank you very much to all four of you. That was excellent. We wouldn't normally now obviously do best speaker and a winning side, but in the absence of any trophies and me having any judging experience, I think what we'll do is just agree to disagree and leave it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you.